Today at the National Press Club, Chief Executive of the Tech Council of Australia, Kate Pounder. What are the technological, economic and political trends that will shape Australia in a post-pandemic world? And the threats, challenges and opportunities. Kate Pounder with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club Westpac address. My name is Emma MacDonald. I am the convener of Women in Media Canberra and the Associate Editor of Her Canberra. Today's speaker is Kate Pounder, the CEO of the Tech Council of Australia, which is the peak body representing Australia's technology sector. Kate will take us through the challenges and opportunities facing the tech industry in a post-pandemic world. If you would like to join the conversation online, please use the hashtag PressClubAust. The handle Press Club Aust or the hashtag NPC. I'd like to welcome Kate.
Thank you, Emma, and Women in Media. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also want to thank everyone who's come along today, particularly those I've worked with through my career, and to also acknowledge the new Shadow Minister for Communications, David Coleman MP. I'm also going to start with a disclosure that may become more common. I'll reassure you that the speech was not written by ChatGPT, but by humans. Some very good ones, I hope. It was tempting, though, as the CEO of a non-profit organisation, to log on and ask ChatGPT, please write a speech about Australia's post-pandemic future, its challenges and opportunities in the style of Michelle Obama. When interest rates go high, tech goes low. Too soon, ChatGPT. That is a joke, by the way. My team and I did genuinely write this speech, and I have enough regard for the journalists in the room to know they would see through an AI-written speech in a heartbeat. My message today for our nation's policymakers and people is, no matter what cyclical downturns tech may face, it is here to stay. It is going to keep growing, and our future prosperity depends upon it. The Tech Council's goal is that by 2030, tech activity across all industries in Australia will contribute $250 billion a year to GDP. We also want 1.2 million people in tech jobs, and for Australia to be the best place to found and scale a tech company. This is absolutely crucial to our country's future. If we want to remain one of the world's most prosperous economies and equal societies, we must keep investing in technology and in our people. We must create new companies, grow new jobs, and train more Australians for them. Because technology isn't just a sector on its own. It's embedded in everything we do. Banking, mining, shopping, entertaining, caring, educating. You name it, without tech, you can't do it. Anyone following the way tech is helping the Ukrainians in their fight for freedom will also know that tech is crucial to our national security. Just as much as mining and agriculture and education, tech is our future. But we need to take this moment to shape that future and to shape the future we want with tech, not to let it shape us. Tech has been in the news recently, not just for ChatGPT and for the visit of Bill Gates to Australia, but because there have been some prominent layoffs at tech firms right across the world. Big numbers, big names, big news. It would be a bigger mistake, however, to make important decisions about Australia's long-term future based on them. Bill Gates once said, people overestimate what they can do in 1 year and they underestimate what they can do in 10 years. That rings true for me because my career has spanned the peaks and troughs of different tech waves. I grew up in a very small country town in South Australia. We had a manual telephone exchange that was operated by a lady named Bev, used right into the 1980s. Our regional TV station received shows on such a long delay that moments of national heartbreak, like the death of Molly on a country practice, occurred about a year later in my town compared to the rest of Australia. It was almost a relief, I've got to say, when it arrived. But in one of those strange career twists, my very first job after university was advising the federal government on new tech policy. And in January 2000, this seemed a great career choice. Dial-up internet had become mainstream in homes and work, accompanied by alien-sounding beeps. New internet companies like Yahoo were making it possible to search the information superhighway. Silicon Valley was booming. But in March 2000, the dot-com bubble burst and the NASDAQ fell. Companies failed, investment in tech bombed, jobs were cut. The internet clearly had no future. It was all hype, so I decided to specialise in broadcasting. I took a job in the media, established in every Australian home. It seemed so much more interesting and secure than the speculative information economy. But I underestimated how much the world could change in 10 years. Broadband, mobile internet, video streaming, and social media took off. These innovations generated new industries, jobs and growth. They made businesses more productive and allowed consumers to get digital services from shopping to entertainment when and where they needed them. And within 7 years, my safe job in the media was made redundant. In a stroke of luck, I got a job working on tech policy again. My career goal for this decade was now not to get fired. But instead, I got a series of incredible job opportunities. My focus on tech led me to work for global consulting companies, the nation's top ICT research institute, and a fast-growing and innovative Australian startup called Alphabeta. Because once again, I'd underestimated how much could change in 10 years, but this time for the better. The downturn that ended my first tech career turned out to be a blip. Tech's rise was inexorable. And the reality is that the tech sector is one of the biggest and most reliable generators of jobs in Australia. Young people, in fact people of all ages who enter it, have a great future ahead of them, especially if we get the policy settings, training and investment levels right. I was bad at picking the future in planning for my career because I based my expectations of what would happen in a decade on what was happening to me in that 1 year. It's why the recent gloom and doom about the tech sector exposes the fallacy of short-term decision-making. Or if I could put it another way, never confuse a short-term cycle for a long-term trend. The high-profile layoffs we've seen lately are due to short-term problems facing all industries. The uncertainty and disruptions to global supply chains created by the COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine, followed by the rise in inflation and the rise in interest rates. Not a great environment for encouraging investment in any industry, nor, as we're seeing, for households, and especially not a great environment in innovative industry sectors like tech. But blips like this will come and go, and they can't and won't change the trend that more of our jobs and more of what we make in Australia will rely on tech. And that's the future we have to start building for today. The type of jobs that we do in Australia are changing, and at every step tech is growing a growing share of them. Over the last year to November 2022, despite all the issues Australia has faced, and despite layoffs at tech firms, the number of tech jobs in Australia increased by 9% to over 900,000. That's part of a multi-decade trend. Over the last 10 years, tech jobs have very consistently grown at double the rate of other jobs in our economy. Double. That's a trend that's withstood multiple downturns, such as the dot-com boom, the GFC, the pandemic, and even now the recent tech contraction. And the reason for this trend is that our economy and workforce are digitising across the board. Around 60% of tech jobs are outside tech companies in Australia. And those industries, like banking, like mining, like government, are still hiring. Concerningly though, for the last decade, the number of people training for and entering tech jobs has remained far lower than the jobs available in Australia. Almost unbelievably, there are roughly the same number of Australians undertaking IT bachelor's degrees today as there were in 2002. That's back when broadband barely existed. That is a time when phones were used for calls, before Facebook was founded. Our children would not recognise that world. I know mine would complain pretty grievously were they forced to return to it today. But yet, today, we're still training Australian teenagers as if that is the world that they will work in. It's why it's more important than ever that we bring Australians' career goals and our training and migration systems into the 21st century, and stat. Because without this change, Australians will miss out on opportunity. And our economy will face a major structural tech skill shortage across the economy of about 180,000 people by 2030. If we can fill that shortfall in the next decade, we'll prevent the future tech skill shortages that will otherwise hold our economy back. We could also make a big dent in major social problems related to youth and mature unemployment and underemployment. And we would also improve the quality of employment. Because compared to other employing sectors, tech jobs are high paid, flexible, more productive, and they have half the gender pay gap of other high paying industries. So my first appeal to governments across Australia today is to double down on addressing the tech skills shortage. It's why, in late March 2022, the Tech Council was proud to join the now Prime Minister and Ministers Ed Husic and Chris Bowen in committing to having 1.2 million people in tech jobs by 2030. We made the commitment to give Australians confidence about their careers over the long term. We stand by it today. But to get there, we're going to need 170,000 first-time workers and 300,000 people who are reskilling and upskilling to join that tech workforce by 2030. So how do we help more Australians get into these tech jobs? We think there are 4 key things to do. The first is we need to inspire more Australians to consider tech careers. The second is we need the right training products and pathways in place. We also need to encourage more women, older Australians, people from regional areas, Indigenous Australians, and people with a disability into tech jobs. And finally, we need to make sure our skill migration system is as responsive as it possibly can be. Progress is now being made, I'm happy to say. In particular, we welcome the reforms promised at the Jobs and Skills Summit. The TCA promised to roll out a virtual work experience program to every secondary school across Australia. And we strongly support Minister Husic and Minister O'Connor's efforts to design a new modern digital apprenticeship scheme for both new and reskilling workers. We also welcome increased investments in visa processing by the government. We believe our migration system should maximise the economic benefits of skilled migration for Australians. That's why we've advocated for a prioritisation of employer-sponsored skilled migration, streamlined arrangements for high salary visa applicants, and internationally competitive visa processing times as part of the migration review. Fixing this system is important to improving the workplace for all Australians. Our gaps in tech are generally in highly experienced, highly technical roles, and we need to fill them to provide a better coaching and workforce experience for the hundreds of thousands of Australians coming through those other training and work pathways. Change is being led outside government too. I'm passionate about improving gender diversity in tech. And I don't think it's yet appreciated, but many of the biggest tech companies in Australia are now headed by female CEOs. That includes Mel Silver at Google, Pip Marlowe at Salesforce, Vicky Brady at Telstra, Kelly Bayer, Ros Masrin at Optus, and of course the TCA's wonderful chair, Robin Denholm, who's also the global chair of Tesla and a partner at VC firm Blackbird. We also have incredible leaders in our startup and scale-up community, people like Mel Perkins of Canva, Catherine McConnell, the founder of Bright, Professor Michelle Simmons at Silicon Quantum Computing and our former Australian of the Year, and Meena Radhakrishnan at Different. And then, of course, in science leadership, we have our national chief scientists, Dr. Cathy Foley and Dr. Bronwyn Fox, the chief scientist at SARO. I'm so excited that my daughter and her friends are growing up seeing this new generation of women leaders in Australia. But change is occurring at the grassroots level too. Geek Girl Academy is an Australian initiative to help women, girls and families find their place and their people in tech. It introduces them to industries including games, 3D printing, drones, space and aviation. It was founded after Australia ran the first all-female hackathon all the way back in 2014. When the pandemic saw children in many places across the country go into lockdown, lots of young people were unexpectedly thrown into online classes. Girl Geek Academy had been planning to host face-to-face work experience programs for high school girls in partnership with Microsoft, and when that was no longer possible, they turned to building a supportive online community of more than 1,000 high school girls learning to build AI. With lockdown 4 looming over Melbourne, the girls confessed they were worried that they'd have to return to online classes, and that would be the worst thing ever. Girl Geek Academy's CEO, Sarah Moran, who I'm so delighted is here today, was confused. She pointed out to the girls that they were already in an online class, and the girls informed her, but Sarah, this isn't a class, it's a community. And for Sarah, that's the key to the program's success. It's not about fixing women or encouraging them, it's about giving them space to build friendships and meaningful support and to see each other participating in tech together. There's other great examples. For example, First Nations leaders in Digitech run programs in remote areas bringing incredible tech skills to young Indigenous Australians. Celeste Carnegie travels from North Queensland to teach kids how to build and code their own electric vehicles using Lego minifigures and Mindstorms. Executive women in corporates like Dale Stevens at Telstra use their experience as business leaders to build successful women in tech programs within larger organisations, ensuring these programs have a line item attached in the company budget and inclusion metrics as part of the leaders' KPI. But there is more we still need to do, with only around 1 in 4 roles in tech held by women. And there's good economic reasons to help more girls and women to get into tech jobs. Claudia Golden, a Harvard professor of economics, tracked the work and care patterns of women in the US over 100 years. She found that occupations in areas like engineering, computing, science and pharmacy are amongst those that have best enabled women to balance work and family. It's no coincidence. She also found that these are some of the highest paying industries that have the lowest gender pay gap. And the reason is that STEM jobs allow more substitutability within the team over the tasks that people do. And that gives people doing them more agency over their time. It means women and men can stay in these senior roles more readily as they begin to balance their caring responsibilities. This is a tough time for the sector. And I'm sorry for anyone who's lost a job or for a company that's had to let value staff go. That is never easy for anyone. But as a nation, we have to keep our eyes on the horizon. The opportunity in tech jobs remains big, and we cannot take our foot off the accelerator in driving the long-term reforms to realise it. My second plea to Australian governments is to get the policy framework right so we can get investment in new ideas, new industries and productivity up. As I said, we want tech activity to contribute $250 billion to GDP by 2030. Yes, investment might be down from record highs, but good ideas survive such temporary downturns and flourish. And flourish they will if we get the policy right. The policy prescriptions relevant to all industries apply to tech. Things like the right tax system, the right R&D incentives, the right foreign investment policies, and the availability of long-term patient public capital to complement the private capital market. Let me focus on that last point. The Australian tech sector sees a crucial role for government in providing patient capital for longer-term strategic investments. A big debate is underway, but there is nothing revolutionary about this sort of role for government. Emerging industries and technologies have always been funded by a mix of private and public capital. Governments across the world have funded basic research in universities and public research institutions like CSIRO. US government defence-funded research famously supported the invention of the internet and autonomous vehicles. Israel has long used small strategic amounts of public capital to attract private investors to high-value strategic sectors. In Australia, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and the Medical Research Future Fund are helping to grow our renewables and medical research capability. Meanwhile, the private sector is a source of new ideas, new companies, new growth and new jobs. It's also the key funder for these companies, such as through venture capital. It was reforms to the tax treatment of early-stage venture capital by the last government that expanded Australia's VC market, and that triggered a blossoming of our local tech ecosystem. So it's with such successful precedents in mind that the Tech Council supports the National Reconstruction Fund as part of a wider suite of investment approaches. We believe the fund can complement private sources of funding for those long-term strategic emerging technologies and industries. The $1 billion critical technologies target in particular has an important role to play in funding those long-term opportunities in the national interest. The design and implementation of the fund will be key to its success. It's why we look forward to working with the government and other stakeholders to get this right should it pass into law. We also need to increase private sector investment through the right incentives. Without it, that target of $250 billion per annum in tech sector activity won't be reached. Tech drives competitiveness, but competitiveness also drives tech. It's well established that the high-performing companies are the ones most likely to invest in innovation. They're also the kind of companies we need to back right now in our economy to get productivity up. That's why one of the Tech Council's major recommendations in our recent budget submission was the establishment of an investment allowance to incentivise investment in priority areas of the economy. This allowance would allow businesses to immediately deduct a share of significant investments in innovative and productive areas. It would cover both tangible and intangible assets. It would give innovative companies across the economy who are focused on solving our nation's big challenges a stronger incentive to invest. That includes in equipment to make their business more efficient, but also in developing software to make products work better. It would encourage existing businesses to bring forward investment over the next 12 to 18 months, when global economic conditions are expected to be tough, boosting our national productivity into the future, the best way, ultimately, to reduce inflation. It will spur business investment in new technologies, such as quantum, AI, cyber and biotech. These measures will help get inflation down while getting investment up. That's because this type of business spending will increase productivity, letting us do more with less as a nation. It's the only recipe for a high standard of living without a high cost to Australians' hip pocket. We need to invest urgently because we're in the middle of a global tech arms race. It's now both a security and economic necessity to have a strong local tech ecosystem, producing, attracting and training globally competitive products and people. Stretched Treasury coffers alone cannot provide the capital that local and global markets can. That's why one of the best ways governments can help businesses access funding, talent and customers is by getting their own regulations and processes right. There are lots of good examples of this already underway, like the simplified trade system reforms. But we now need to look at other areas, such as Australia's foreign investment process. It's the 34th least efficient process in the world out of 38 OECD countries. That places Australia behind allies like the US and UK, and countries such as Turkey, Poland and Chile. These types of reforms are necessary to grow Australia's critical tech industries, such as quantum and cyber. Research by the Tech Council has shown that these industries are more dependent on global funding, networks and specialist expertise. Australia's quantum sector, for example, attracts 3.6% of all funding invested globally in quantum, despite Australia having 1.6% of GDP. It's why we have suggested that when governments seek to apply restrictive regulation to a critical tech industry, they should also find a countervailing regulatory offset that improves an administrative process or burden. And there are many more smart reforms to governance services and processes on offer. Tackling them as a priority will improve productivity as well as citizen and business experience. Success in tech is definitely possible for Australia. There is much cause for bullishness. Despite having just 1.6% of global GDP, Australia is now creating 2.3% of global unicorn companies. That's tech companies valued at $1 billion or more. It includes companies like Airwallex, Atlassian, Safety Culture, Canva, Culture Amp, and many more. We've also attracted some of the world's largest global tech companies and investors to Australian shores, such as Microsoft, IBM, and Amazon Web Services. Few Australians probably realise, but software was Australia's most successful new industry of the last decade. And Australia and New Zealand have a particular strength, I'm really proud to say, in designing software for small to medium businesses. Cloud-based companies like Xero, Deputy, Employment Hero have put critical accounting, rostering and payroll software into the hands of small businesses for the first time. It's helped small businesses around the country lift their productivity, steady their cash flow, and save them from admin so they can spend more time on what matters, their business and their family. Now, a next wave of companies is being created that is drawing off Australia's strengths in traditional industries such as agriculture, education, mining, and finance. And as tech spreads, it's creating opportunity across Australia. Firmus, a young Australian company, has created one of the world's most environmentally sustainable data centre technologies from its R&D base in northern Tasmania. It's working with global tech leader NVIDIA to deploy AI technology to existing data centres to reduce their environmental impacts and running costs. Meanwhile, AirTrunk is investing in world-leading data infrastructure in Western Sydney while exporting their technology across Asia to Singapore, Hong Kong and Vietnam. Quantum Billions, so I'll give a shout out for a very successful raise very recently, is an Australian quantum company that's building quantum computer products based on synthetic diamonds here in Canberra and testing them on the Pawsey supercomputer in Perth. Illumination in Adelaide and Go1 from Logan in Brisbane are changing how kids and small businesses learn. We may not be able to match the spend of big nations like the US and China, but we can absolutely match their smarts. And one of the tech areas we need to be smart in is cybersecurity. I therefore want to end with a third call to action: how we can help protect Australia from cyber threats. We shouldn't simply accept that an ever-increasing number and severity of cybersecurity incidents is the cost of doing business online. We've overcome huge safety challenges in other areas of life, thanks to sustained incremental technology and policy improvements. Far fewer people are dying on our roads. And we can make this sort of progress again with a national culture of cyber safety implemented through a real partnership with industry, government and the community. It's a prime example of how we can use this current moment to build the country we want in 10 years. The Tech Council believes there are 4 essential components to lifting our cyber resilience. 1, a new national cybersecurity plan underpinned by effective coordination between the public and private sectors. 2, a strong pipeline of cyber and tech talent. 3, better use and adoption of technologies like digital identity verification that can help prevent or reduce the damage caused by successful cyber attacks. 4, a modernised legal framework fit for the digital age that creates the right incentives for organisations to invest in the appropriate collection, use and protection of data. Creating the necessary cyber workforce will bring wider benefits to the whole country. LinkedIn data shows that Australia's workforce of cybersecurity professionals grew by over 80% between December 2018 and December 2022. However, despite this strong growth, according to Per Capita, we need 8,000 more cyber workers now, and we'll be short 30,000 within 4 years. These jobs are not only essential to protect our nation, they pay well and they'll help reduce the gender pay gap if we get more women into them. A great example of this is Amber Spence, who joined the Aussie consulting firm CyberCX in 2020. She's a former touring rock musician, a mum, and now, thanks to CyberCX Women in Cyber Scholarship, an ethical hacker in their security assurance and testing practice. I know how important opportunities like this can be. I lost my job when I was home on maternity leave. Getting a new job in a flexible, fast-growing industry gave me the opportunity to start again. It's why I want to see more opportunities created for more women and more Australians, so that in the next decade, there'll be 1,000 more stories like Amber's to tell. Making the reforms I'm calling for today won't be easy, but it will be necessary if we want to maintain Australia's standing in the world. We have to start the policy reform and the investment now, with the view to where it will take us 10 years from now. It's about ensuring our future economic security and our future national security, because tech is about all our industries, all our jobs, and the quality of life of all our people. Despite our current economic lows, we must still aim high and think long term. We have to get policy right and opportunity and investment rising. And if we do, we'll lay the foundations for an even better future for our children, our communities, and our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I personally could tell that that speech was written by humans and delivered from the heart. So well done for avoiding ChatGPT. We're going to turn to questions from the media, but I would like to ask the first question about tech's issue with diversity. And you talk about how it is a great industry for women, but 25% participation is not great. Just this week, I interviewed a young woman who's the first Indigenous female to graduate with an IT degree from her university. And my Year 8 daughter is one of 2 girls in her IT elective. There are clearly problems in the pipeline. What are those problems and how do we remove them?
Yeah, and you should definitely get her into Girl Geek Academy. I'll have to introduce you later.
Hook me up, yeah.
The thing I find really interesting is that the word computer used to refer to a human. That was back in the 1940s. It was people who would do manual calculations, and it almost always referred to a woman. In fact, to the point when people would talk about how productive computing was, they'd measure it in girl hours. And then what happened, over sort of the subsequent 70 years is we sort of ended up with an industry where now women are generally around a quarter of the people undertaking uni courses, around a quarter of the people in these tech jobs. So one way I try to think about how would we solve it today is what do we reverse and what do we change such that we moved from having a higher representation of women back to a lower one. And I think one of the first things that changed was cultural representations. People actively tried to get more men into the roles because they were seen as strategic and had high prestige. Meanwhile, in an era of video games and computing, they were sort of perceived as boys' toys. And, those things changed whether women saw a place for themselves in those roles. I think, that can be reflected sometimes through the education system. So absolutely starting in schools and supporting teachers to encourage and involve and excite lots of different kids in tech and in these new jobs is really important. It's why we want to have this virtual work experience program so that we can bring that to kids and they can decide for themselves what they think that they can be in their future. But there's many more things we need to do right up into the workforce to change that culture and to create those opportunities.
All right, our next question is James Riley from Innovation Australia.
Oh yeah, hi Kate, thanks for that presentation. It was very broad as the industry itself, I guess. I'll go to the pointy end of things, straight to quantum computing. I think you've got a separate subset within Tech Council looking at quantum. Ed Husick's considering a quantum computing report right now, and we expect to hear his reflections on that soon. I guess as we move from researching quantum, where Australia has had a lead, as you mentioned, towards commercialisation, what can you see as specific measures that we can take that Australia can capture the IP developed here to build an industry here and reap the benefits of that, long-term investment that, consecutive Australian governments and educational institutions have made?
It's a great question. Thank you, James. You're right, Australia has a long and fine tradition in quantum research and computing, and as a consequence of that, we have some outstanding companies already here, some outstanding researchers already here. So the main practical steps that we would like to see in the strategy are ones that help that industry scale. And we think a first critical piece of that will be funding. It is still a nascent industry, still an emerging industry, so measures like the National Reconstruction Fund, other complementary funding initiatives that help those companies get through that continuing R&D cycle will be really vital to ensure that they scale and are able to build global companies here from our shores. But it's also about making sure they can get access to global capital. As we saw, we're very successful at attracting it. And it's often not simply about the finance, it's about the relationships it brings to customers globally, it's about the access to talent and knowledge. So continuing to ensure that we're not losing that because of inefficient administrative processes, we think is important. And then talent is obviously key, continuing to train that pipeline of Australians, to keep those experienced talents here, to bring in others where we need them to help. That will be vital to build the industry.
Our next question is Simon Gross from Canberra IQ.
Thank you, Emma. My question follows from yours, and I'm going to try and dig a bit deeper. You talked about encouraging or supporting the teachers and to encourage kids to get into STEM courses. Unfortunately, there's an attitudinal problem and there's a structural problem. Figures came out last year. The proportion of HSC students going through to the end with maths is falling, both across all genders. The universities are responding by not requiring maths as a prerequisite to enter STEM courses. Part of the problem is school kids think maths is too hard. So I wonder if you have any reflections on that attitudinal stuff in our teenagers and the response of the education system.
It's an important question. Maths, and particularly areas like statistical thinking and analysis, are really vital as we see technologies like AI become more mainstream. And I'd really encourage kids and their parents and teachers to persist. Maths is something that often takes practice, but it is such an important life skill. So we would, we support initiatives to try and see its teaching supported through the school system and to see more Australian children attaining higher levels of proficiency at it. But I would also say this, there are many, many other skills that are also just as important, and I think sometimes it is a focus on very theoretical maths in units like Maths 1 and Maths 2 that can discourage a broader range of people from participating in tech, and not every job requires maths at that level, and it's not always representative of what the experience of working in the sector is like. And I can see Fleur Anderson sitting here today. I'll give a shout out for Enterprising Girls. It's a really amazing program going on around schools, which is helping encourage girls think about how they can found their own business and take those big ideas. And I think those skills are equally important, and I'd love to see an equal focus on them.
Kate, if you are speaking to parents or students who are watching today, what are some of the skills that make good IT workers of the future? What should people be focusing on?
Can I reflect on why I didn't get ChatGPT to write my speech? Because it was tempting. I didn't get it to write the speech because I wanted to talk about tech jobs, and in order to talk about tech jobs, I needed to know what was actually happening in the data. I was reading a lot of stories like others thinking that there were layoffs, so I said to my team, can you please go back and repeat this methodology for analysing that data that we did last year? And that took a lot of skill. It's not immediately sitting on the ABS website where you can just Google it and get the number. They had to download data sets, link them together, do that analysis. They had to check it and test it. ChatGPT doesn't do that. So that skill of framing a problem, knowing how to structure analysis for it, knowing how to check and test it, that's a really vital skill. The second thing ChatGPT couldn't have done is tell you those stories that I did about Australian businesses. And I know those stories because it's my job as CEO to get out and talk to my members and hear the opportunities, hear the challenges, develop all that tacit knowledge that comes through a human relationship and lived experience. ChatGPT can't do that. Those skills will remain vital. I didn't get it to write it as well because I wanted to say something that was original, and I had help from some great writers in doing that. And I think still today, knowing how to speak in your own voice, knowing how to come up with original ideas and express them in a way that will mean something to the audience, that's again not something that generative AI can do. So those kind of skills, and they're probably not skills that will surprise any journalist in the room, but they're really important skills that what make us human, and I think they're the ones we have to double down on.
Nick Stewart from the Canberra Times.
Everyone agrees that we do need to invest in this area, but where? I mean, we can never compete with the sort of investment that other countries or businesses like in the US where they're putting their money. How do you referred to the waves that we've had in the industry. How do we make sure that we're at the forefront of a wave like the quantum wave and actually remain there rather than drop off because there just isn't enough money? Do we need to pick winners? Do we need to throw it open so that great companies can emerge? How do we do it?
It's such a great question. Firstly, I think we have to back our strengths and back good people with good ideas. And I don't think that's as simple as picking winners, because sometimes a winner can come from a really unexpected place. But I do think we should be looking to the types of industries where we know we can lead the world. Maybe because we have a research strength there, which was certainly the story with quantum. Maybe because we have some particular advantage. That's why we saw the software industry, particularly enterprise software, perform so well, because we had this great skills base, and in a software industry, you can sell to the world and it doesn't matter how far away you are from your customers. And then I think those industries that build on our traditional domain strengths, so ag tech and mining tech, ed tech, they're the areas where we're seeing this great new pipeline of companies. And I think it's because it is blending those new and traditional strengths in our economies. What I think it takes to support them is generally getting the foundations right. I'm a big believer that if you get your core training and education system working, if you get your basic tax settings right, if you get your regulatory settings to a point where they're harmonised and globally competitive, then you're going to float the most boats possible, and it will be industry agnostic, so you don't have to worry about picking industry winners. If, though, there's particular industries or areas that are longer term areas of research that need some investment, that's where we have our more strategic funding mechanisms and perhaps a role for government. But I think that combination of those three things is what it'll take to build the next generation of Aussie companies.
Our next question is Quentin Dempster from the New Daily.
Kate, thanks for painting the picture about future employment possibilities for all the parents of Australia worried about how in heaven's name their children are going to sustain themselves into the future. Australia arguably has been de-skilled because of policy failure in vocational education and problems with tertiary education. You've canvassed an objection about maths, or a hurdle about maths, and you've canvassed other skills. For all the educators out there listening to you and understanding that we could get to over 1 million tech jobs by 2030, what priorities do you put on their thinking about the skills that they should be offering through all the institutions, the educational institutions of Australia?
Thank you, Quentin. I talked earlier about the skills that I think are important: problem solving, collaboration, creative thinking, as well as those knowledge-based skills like maths and statistical analysis. I think all they'll be important, but can I talk a bit about how I think people will learn? And I want to build there on your question around the tertiary system and the vet system. One thing that's interesting to me is that if you look at the results in the vet system at the moment in IT qualifications, only around 40% of students who are going through those qualifications are getting a better job as a consequence, which is pretty strange given the employment market that we've seen for those roles. If you look, though, at areas in the private sector, at Academy XI, if you look at 42, this very innovative school in Adelaide, which offers free computer science and software engineering education, they're getting something like 90% employment outcomes. So I think one thing we could really do is support our teachers in the public sectors to be able to build on and apply some of those techniques that we're seeing in the private sector, which are clearly enabling people to learn in ways that are helping them get into those jobs. And I think we can also consider how we can help kids learn through a variety of models, because I think the more we have to reskill and upskill, or the more people want to find their community, they're not always going to find it in one classroom. So making sure that there is a real breadth in the educational opportunities available will be important.
Kate, the more I read about AI, the more I have to quell my rising sense of existential dread. Maybe it's just me. Do you think we need some sort of global regulatory framework or safeguards or moral code so that we don't end up facing Singularity/Armageddon/the Terminator?
It's not on my top 3 list of things that keep me up at night, I have to say. I think about AI as being akin to the type of IT revolution that we saw in the 1990s and 2000s, where we saw personal computing move through homes and workplaces, where we saw broad-based software techniques like the Microsoft Office package with Excel and word processing, which were pretty transformational in their time, moving from writing on paper and doing calculations by hand to having these computers available and processing for them. And that was associated with actually a big productivity boost, probably one of the last we've really had in our economies. And I think AI will be more like that it is a very broad-based set of different types of innovations. They'll have multiple different applications, and I don't think it's as simple as having one regulatory framework to fit them all. But I think each of them will bring with them both opportunities and challenges, and it's important to start thinking now about where our Australian or global frameworks are adequate, where they're not, and how we might update them, and do that ideally in a harmonised fashion, because we're all operating in a global world.
Still might have nightmares. Misha Schubert, Vice President of the National Press Club.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Kate, for your speech. The country is gearing up this year to potentially go to a vote, national referendum on the voice and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representation and consultation embedded in the Constitution. Does the Tech Council have a position on that? And your members include some of the biggest companies in Australia. Do you anticipate that they will be campaigning on that issue during the course of the year?
Thank you for the question. It's an important one, Misha. As the Tech Council, we're conscious that we vote as citizens, not as an industry association or as companies. So we'll work with our members, we'll work with our board to consider what role we might play and how we can be most constructive, whether that's taking a position, whether that's sharing information through the process. I do want to say this, though, because I don't want to dodge the question. If I can answer it as a citizen rather than as a CEO, I think this is an important moment for us as a country, and I'll be voting yes, and I'll be doing that for 2 reasons. One, I think it is a sensible and constructive evolution of our parliamentary model to add an explicit requirement to listen. I think most of us, when we see Parliament on TV and the heat and light of question time, we think about debate and we think about speeches, we think less about listening, but it's obviously a very key part to solving complex problems. And so I support the model partly for that reason. And secondly, I think Parliament, like any good Australian home, is always one in occasional need of renovation, and we've had a very strong tradition of quiet, sensible, constructive reforms. I think we're both South Australians. We know it was one of the states that was the first in the world to give women the right to vote. I think in that sense of that long tradition, this is another moment, a moment for the people of our generation to think about the kind of country we want to take into the future. So I'll be voting yes, but that I say that in a personal capacity. It's obviously the choice of every Australian voter to see where they want to take the country.
Our next question is Brandon Howe from Innovation Australia.
Thanks for your address, Kate. You mentioned in your speech the need for a modernised legal framework around the collection, use and protection of data. given the Minister for Cybersecurity, after her press club address last year, mentioned, if I may paraphrase, that it's untrue that wherever data is located, it can equally be held safe. What role do you think data localization can play in the protection of Australian consumers' data? And perhaps slightly tangentially, the e-safety commissioner has told the tech platforms to reevaluate their draft industry codes on online safety. And she said in estimates yesterday that a lot of the feedback she gave was feedback that she'd raised previously. How confident are you that the tech platforms will align their interests with government to get their codes passed?
Thank you, Brandon, for those questions. On data localisation, the Tech Council, which is predominantly Australian companies, doesn't support data localisation as a default requirement, and we certainly don't think it's an answer that in the majority of cases that makes data safer. In fact, it actually often adds resilience if data can be held in multiple locations. We think it is obviously important to think about where it's held and who it's held by, but we have a number of allies, and the answer must not always be Australian. In fact, we don't think it should be. And in fact, there would be a number of Australian tech companies who would find it pretty hard to operate globally, given we're an industry specialising in software, to introduce requirements like that. That's not to say that there aren't certain data sets that are subject to data localisation requirements and quite appropriately held, often here in Canberra, but they're not the main portion of data that we have. And, Ukraine was a really telling example of that, where when they fell under attack, one of the first things they had to do was to think about how they ensured that some of their critical and sensitive data was backed up in locations outside their country. On the question of the online safety codes, it's obviously important to keep people safe online. The Tech Council hasn't been one of the groups that's been directly involved in developing the codes, but we encourage industry and government to work together to come to a sensible resolution. And I think it's also important, though, that whatever proposals are put on the table are ones that are practical to implement, because obviously we don't keep people safe by calling for action that can't practically be done. So I hope that the e-safety commissioner and the industries will keep working together to try and find that really sensible midpoint. Thank you.
On the issue of data protection, how well or how badly do you think Optus and Medibank handled their cyber attacks? And are companies moving fast enough to ensure that they're ahead of the hackers?
I think in a digital world, cybersecurity will always be a challenge, because there are so many different potential vulnerabilities. But I also believe that the attacks that we saw, the attacks that are increasing, have triggered a cultural change, and it's an issue that more and more Australians and more companies are taking very seriously. And I have a lot of faith that Australia can be a highly resilient nation on cyber. We're one of the world's top adopters of technology. It's actually one of the features that can make us vulnerable to attack. I think it's a feature we need to be thinking about how we turn it to our own advantage, so that we're not only leading in online shopping, but also, I hope, in online security.
All right, Maddie Green is up next, and she's from the UC Press Club.
Thank you, Kate, for your question. From your broadcast and media background, how do you feel that IT is changing the media? Should we stay away from it, or should we be excited about the future of it?
It's a great question. Thank you for it. Digital technologies are transforming how we can tell stories. And for anyone working in the media who really gets out of bed in the morning to do that, I think it's a really exciting time actually to be a practitioner, because you can reach more audiences in more ways, and you have more creative control in some ways over that technology to go out into your communities and tell your own story. So I see it as a net positive, and I think it meant, ultimately for a lot of media companies, they had to start thinking about their audiences more carefully and start thinking about how there were different groups within them and how they could make content that could appeal to different people. So I think it's a net positive, but I think it also requires understanding how to use the technology to be a practitioner in the 21st century.
Thank you.
Our next question is Maurice Riley, who's the CEO of the National Press Club.
Thanks, Emma. I'm asking this on behalf of Tim Shaw, who's texted a question in. He asks, Kate, can you tell us which local tech sector jobs do you think your own members expect to directly provide in new manufacturing in Australia by 2030? Tesla made here perhaps, or perhaps in the, there's a big project down there in Geelong, the Recharge Industries.
Yeah, Recharge is a great company, excited by that. Most of my members are Australian companies, but including ones that manufacture. And I think the areas where we'll see more activity based here will be the areas where Australia has that real competitive advantage. So areas that are high skill, areas that are high value, areas that build on a strength that we already have in Australia, and where we're therefore sort of competitive with other countries around the world. And that might be areas like batteries, it might be areas like sensors, it might be advanced electronics. We're seeing with SunDrive a sort of return to thinking about solar panel manufacturing. So those are the ones I would be getting excited about right now.
Okay, and on indulgence, Emma, we're seeing that there's a lot of security implications in IT. We've seen America and its allies start to, reduce cooperation with China in particular. Where do you think this is going to? What sort of impediments will that create for innovation if we can't collaborate with, these sorts of countries?
It's an important question. Every successful global tech company we've built in Australia has been a global one. And those global flows of trade, of people, of finance, the ability of companies to build customer bases overseas will continue to be important. Obviously, there are technologies that are more sensitive, and they're the ones where I think we'll see a greater bias to co-developing them and co-funding them with allies. And we are seeing that already through the AUKUS and Quad arrangements. But, ultimately we do live in a global and connected world, and I think we will never shut ourselves off completely from anyone.
Okay.
Kate, I've got to ask, how do you think Elon Musk is affecting perceptions of leadership in tech?
I was interested, I think it was at the end of last year, the AFR ran a story where they'd asked Australian executives who was the one person they really wanted to have dinner with, and it was Elon Musk. So I think people certainly think he would be an interesting conversationalist. He's a pretty incredible innovator, is the truth. He's worked across finance, across electric vehicles, across the internet technologies, and I think has made some pretty profound innovations and transformations. And there are, kids today probably interested in those areas because they've seen his story. But no industry can be reduced to an individual. And I think the strength of any industry is that it has multiple leaders and they're diverse and they let a lot of different people see themselves in it. So I would never, want my children to think, unless they're Elon Musk, they can't have a career. That's why I'm so proud that we have so many female leaders, for example, in Australia in the tech sector.
We're going to go back to James from Innovation Australia.
Oh yeah, thank you again, Kate. I have a lot of questions, but I'll try and just keep it to one. And interesting that you've just brought up Elon Musk. So my very boring question is one that I asked Robin Denham, the chair of Tesla, when she was speaking here last year, and it was around culture. I think in that speech she talked about Tesla's own needs to, the number of cars it needs to build in the next 10 years means it's going to need X number of gigafactories, and maybe Australia could be home to one of those factories. Now that would take a lot of work from a lot of people to get that kind of investment in this country, but it's very ambitious. The figure that you gave about the number of students doing computer science now is about the same as 2002 is really quite incredible. And I'm wondering, culturally, what is it about Australians or Australia right now that doesn't see the incredible opportunities in this sector? I guess I would say that we seem to be a nation that sees technology built overseas and consumed here. What do we do in primary schools and secondary schools to energise that kind of thinking that we do stuff here?
Another very good question, James. I think telling stories about ourselves is vital, and having those positive role models that people can look to and see themselves in. I was so pleased. My son came home last year from school and told me one of his first assignments in his first weeks of high school was to profile an entrepreneur, and he chose Mel Perkins, and he said, "Oh, she's from Canva, she's one of your members, I'm going to choose her from a list of 40, which included some much more traditional people and more traditional industries. So I get excited when I hear that, because I think when our kids know the names of some of the people who've created companies, when they know a company like Canva, which has tools they're using in schools to do presentations, when they know that was built here, then I think it gives them a sense that this could be something that they could do and something that they can see themselves in. And I'd love to bust some stereotypes about tech. We spoke earlier about the maths education, and I'm a big believer in it, as my kids have discovered to their peril when they tried not to do their homework. But, it's so much more than that. And that's why I think we also have to really help people see the creativity of these jobs, see the breadth of these jobs, understand that they require a really different variety of people in them, because then I think we won't have a trouble inspiring people to get into them.
Our final question is from Simon Gross.
Hello again. You said in your speech, without tech, you can't do it. And you talked about a huge range of the sectors of our society and our economy that are dependent on tech to basic functions. Now, tech's dependent on electricity. So that's a deeper, more fundamental foundation we need to maintain, and we are aware that our electricity supplies are a bit febrile from time to time, and looking ahead, that's going to be an ongoing issue for some years. What does your organisation, do you have a policy or an agenda about maintaining reliable and affordable electricity supplies in Australia?
This is an opportunity for Australia that I don't think we reflect on enough, that, as we move to digitalise our economy, it's so vital we don't recarbonise it. And I think we have some real strengths in Australia that can help us here. The fact that we can be a renewable energy superpower, that we have so much of that available here, that we've made advances, I think, in updating our own networks and in applying really innovative analytics and software to them to help manage them as we are switching the mix of sources that we're using. I'm excited by the fact that we're seeing data infrastructure being built in Australia, which is beating the world in terms of its energy productivity. I mentioned Firmus earlier. That's a company out of northern Tasmania in Melbourne, but it was founded by people who came from the mining industry, and they applied some of the smart thinking that they had learned in mining to solving the energy productivity challenges of data centres. I mentioned AirTrunk, which is one of our unicorn companies that's also transforming how we build and run data centres to try and really bring their energy usage down, and not only doing that in parts of Australia like Western Sydney, but exporting that technology to the world and actually thinking about how we might ultimately export data into Australia and host it here, because we will be able to do it more productively, more reliably than others. I think those are really exciting opportunities. And so for me, it's starting with that outcome and starting with that opportunity and thinking about how we build the right foundation to achieve it. That's most important now.
Thank you. Katie, thank you for that wonderful address and good handling of all the questions. It's my great pleasure. Before you jump off the stand, there's a thank you from the Press Club, and that is a lifetime membership of the National Press Club. And we would...